In this exercise, we're going to be going over Chapter 6, Challenge Problem 6.5, Track Your Investments. So in this one, it wants us to write a function called invest that takes three parameters: our principal amount, the annual rate of return, the interest rate, and the number of years to calculate for. It even gives us a helpful little hint about our signature for our function. It then wants us to print out the amount of the investment rounded to two decimal places at the end of each year. And here's some example output. And then it wants us to use user input for those values. So as you know from reading the chapter, before we can call a function, we have to define it. So we will start with defining our function, call it invest, and we'll go ahead and use the sample that they gave up top in the text. So we have def, the keyword def, our function name, the arguments, and then we always end with a colon. And then everything in the function needs to be indented. So remember that. So what we want to do is we want to calculate the total for each year. So to start off with, let's go ahead and create a local variable called total, and we'll set it equal to the amount. So this is the initial amount they input. Now every year, the total is going to go up by whatever was in there before, so total. And then we also want to add the interest, which is whatever was in there before multiplied by the rate. We want to do that for each year. So in this case, this is a good example of a case where we should use a for loop. So in this case, we want to loop for a number of years, whatever this input is. So let's go ahead and route out our for loop. And the syntax for that is we start with for. And what we can do is say year in and range. Well, let's use another variable. We'll say n in range, and we can just say year here. So this is the number of years. In fact, let's change that to years, and then we can use year here for our variable here. We can put whatever we want here, but to make it more readable, we'll say for year in range years. What this range is going to mean is it's going to loop from default to 0. If we wanted to start at, say, the third year, we could do this, right? But we want to go from 0 to the number of years input. And then you also need a colon there. And that'll be your for syntax. Now, everything that we want to execute in the body of the for loop needs to be indented. So in this case, we want to calculate our new total. So our total is now equal to whatever was there before plus the whatever was in there before times the rate, which will give us what we gained on interest. Now we want to output something like this. So we call the print function. Normally we'd have something like this. We want to use some variables here. So this we want to be whatever year it is, and then this we want to be the new total. So we're going to use string interpolation. So we start with f, and then in here, this value, we want it to be 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. So we're going to use this year variable we declared here. So what that'll do, oops, so let's put that back. So year, so the first time through the loop, it'll be 1, and then 2, then 3, then 4. And then we want our value here. So we keep the $, and we put the new total. And we wanted to display it as currency. So we basically want to take it to 2 places after the decimal. So we do :.2f. And that'll end our for loop. And in this case, all we're doing in this function is printing output. So we really don't need to return anything from our function. So now let's test it out. So let's call our function invest with the values shown up here. So 100, 0.05, and 4. And let's see what happens. You see we got our output. Now notice that these say 0, 1, 2, and 3. So in this case, the range starts at 0 and goes up to, but not including it goes up to this number here. So this essentially says how many times it's going to loop. So what we can do is we can just add 1 here. Right? Or we could do a range of 1 to years plus 1. But this way is pretty easy here. So let's run this again. In this case, year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. All right, so that's well and good, but now it wants us to prompt the user for initial amounts, the annual percentage rate, and then number of years. So to get inputs, we use the input function. So let's do this. Let's say our initial amount equals, we're going to say input, and let's prompt the user, enter the initial amount. Now we want the percentage rate. So let's say annual rate, input, enter the annual percentage rate. We also want the number of years. Let's say num years equals input, enter the number of years. So now we have that user input all in variables. Just to make sure we don't have any obvious syntax errors, I'm going to go ahead and just run it. And it's going to prompt us for these values. And no errors. It didn't output anything we haven't asked it to, but I just wanted to make sure there were no errors yet. So now we want to call our invest function with these inputs. So we can say invest. We're going to say init for initial amount. We can say annual rate for the rate, and we can say num years for the years. Now, when I execute this, there's going to be an error. If you'd like, you can pause the video and see if you can figure out what that error is going to be. A hint is that we've seen this error in multiple other videos. So I'm going to go ahead and hit run. I'm going to enter those same values. You can see our error. It says string object cannot be interpreted as an integer. So there are multiple issues here, but the first time it runs into it is when it tries to input it here. Now you could kind of tell earlier when I started to do a range, you could see it's underlined here. It doesn't like the fact that it's a string. So what we want to do is we want to cast it to an integer. Years won't be a float because we don't want to calculate partial years. It's always going to be a whole number. We can cast it to an integer like that. Before I run it again, we'll know that we'll have the same issues elsewhere. If it treats all input as strings, then we're going to have issues here when we try to do math on strings. So our total is going to be this. We want to have a float in case they want to use a partial, like $100.50 or something. And then for our rate, that's also going to be a float. Okay, so now we should have nothing but numbers here. So total is going to be a float. We're casting years to an integer here. And here we're casting rate to a float before doing our math. Just go ahead and run this again. We'll put 100, 0.05, and 4. You can see we get our outputs as expected. So in this short video lecture, we went over again functions, but now we introduced loops. And we also reviewed issues of input function. That's something you're going to come across a lot. When you get input from a user, you're going to have to remember to always cast it. We could have done something like, if we know this is always going to be a float, for instance, we could have done this. Just cast it. We could have just cast it, sorry, right after we got it from the user. That's one way to do it. But in this case, we went ahead and cast it inside our function, which is a form of defensive programming. If we are defining this function, we want to make sure that anybody calling it, if they accidentally send us a string, we go ahead and do the conversion within our function. So we don't have to count on whoever's calling the function to do it. So if you have any questions on this challenge problem, feel free to email me, or even better, start a conversation in Canvas. Thanks.